Good morning. BJ mentioned our Resurrection Sunday services that we'll have a special 7:45 service, and what he didn't mention to you is that we will bribe those who come to the 7:40 service with refreshments and pastries and donuts and coffee and things of that nature. So if somehow you're in the 11:30 service today and you're willing to come to that 7:45 service on Resurrection Sunday, it will be the only service where food is served. And after all, we've been talking about a place at the table, so that would be a good thing for you. Let me give a little shout out to BJ Bungard for stepping up to the plate at the last minute last week and preaching the Zacchaeus sermon. Yes, give him a hand for that. It was surreal for me because I was sitting in an apartment in the Maritimes and the snow's blowing outside, so I opened the shades, watched the snow blowing, and went online and heard the birds chirping and watched cars pulling in the parking lot here from the construction cameras on Sunday morning. I really appreciate BJ stepping in at the last minute like that. I had a little sermon on Zacchaeus prepared, but it was just going to be a wee little sermon, and so I was glad that BJ stepped in and did that. Where is your favorite place to eat? Jesus could certainly answer that question. He had a lot of places to choose from. Hillside picnics with thousands of people, waterfront breakfast with freshly caught seafood, formal dinners with high-profile guests, fast food from the fields with his disciples, wedding banquets with lavish buffets like the one they had when they ran short of wine and Jesus turned the water into wine. At the risk of being repetitive, let me remind you of what we've been attempting to do all through the month of March and even into April. We plan to sit at multiple different tables with Jesus and a variety of his guests. But here's our goal: not only to see what happened at those tables and not only to meet those gathered at those tables, but to hear Jesus at those tables and to clearly see his vision for us. And I'll repeat what I said when we began this series. The longer I serve Jesus, the more I believe a statement I heard a preacher friend of mine once say. The question is not, does your church have a vision? The question is, does Jesus' vision have your church? And so we've been trying to see Jesus' vision for the church at the table. And the first table we visited was the table of Simon the Pharisee. And you remember at that table there was a woman of questionable reputation, and Jesus met her need and answered her and showed us that his vision for the table is a table where everyone is welcome. And then last week we visited the table of Zacchaeus. It's a table of transformation. We come just as we are, but we don't stay just as we are. Jesus wants to change us at the table, and we want this table here at Mount Gilead to be a table of transformation. So, back to Jesus' favorite place to eat. Where was it? I know, you super spiritual people will remind us that Jesus once said, "Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." And that Jesus said, "My food is to do the will of my Father who is in heaven." And that Jesus said, "I have food to eat that you know nothing about." Yeah, we get all that, but he still had to eat. He was human, right? And he did eat, often. I remember in our old school prophet series, we looked at the prophet Elisha, and we said that Elisha would often stop at the home of a Shunammite woman to eat food there. And I remember pointing out it's one of the greatest preacher texts in the Bible because it says she persuaded him to eat food. I mean, how hard is that, to persuade a preacher to eat food? So where was Jesus' favorite place? Where did he like to go to eat? My guess is at the table of his friends, Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Now, we don't know how many times Jesus parked his feet at the table of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, but it was probably many, many times. And for lack of creativity, we'll just call it the Bethany table because they lived in Bethany. It was a table of growth and maturity and nourishment. Jesus nourishes and grows and stretches us at the table. Now, as many times as Jesus must have eaten there, we actually only get a detailed glance at a few of the table scenes with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and we'll just talk about them this way. Table number 1, table number 2, and table number 3. Table number 1, Luke chapter 10. This is perhaps the first time that he ate there. Verse 38, it says, as they were traveling along, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. And she had a sister called Mary who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all of her preparations, and she came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Tell her to help me. But the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you're worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing is necessary, for Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Now, could we just admit something here? This text has been beaten to death. It's been wrung out for every nuance and every possible implication for centuries. Martha working in the kitchen, Mary at his feet listening. Martha irritated and complaining, Mary sweetly listening and being defended by Jesus. And if we're not careful when we enter this scene, we will end up in the wrong place. Because this doesn't mean learning is good and serving is bad. It doesn't mean that sitting is healthy and working is unhealthy. It doesn't mean that Martha is bad and Mary is good, that Martha is unspiritual and Mary is spiritual. I would remind you, it was Martha who welcomed him. It was Martha's house. It was Martha who was busily serving him. Scripture says that Jesus loved Mary and Martha. And when we go to the next table, we're going to see Martha serving at that table too. She was the one who actually came out to meet Jesus after their brother died while Mary stayed in the house crying. And in this instance, Martha was simply distracted and worried about too many details, whereas Mary was so enthralled with Jesus' words, she was willing to have a simpler, easy meal and get right to the fellowship. While I was actually in the act of preparing this message, I was in my office at home. My wife had worked late the night before, and she had just gotten up, and she walked into my office, and she said, I just had this crazy dream. And I said, what? And she said, I dreamed that we invited the whole church over for dinner. I said, honey, that's not a dream. That's a nightmare. She said, yeah, everybody came. They were all here. This place was just full, and I had forgotten to fix anything to eat. And she said, I was scrounging through the cabinets and through the refrigerator trying to find something to eat. And I thought, man, if I could just send her to a therapist right now, what they would uncover about why she had that dream. Well, that's the situation Martha was in. She had invited a special person to dinner, and she wanted everything to be just right. And she got a little too caught up and carried away in all the details, trying to make everything just perfect. Mary was the devotional student type, and Martha was the practical servant type, and their brother Lazarus was probably just the when are we going to eat type. But here's the deal. Jesus helps all of them grow at the table, even in their frustrations and differences, actually, maybe even through their frustrations and differences. And I find it very interesting when I read this story to read what's on either side of it, because Luke sandwiches this between the story of the Good Samaritan serving and the teaching of the disciples to pray the Lord's Prayer, devotion. So this story that has both devotion and serving in it is sandwiched between a story of serving, the Good Samaritan, and a story of devotion, teaching the disciples to pray the Lord's Prayer. I found out through Drew Thurman about a documentary on two famous NBA players, Magic Johnson and Larry Bird. And in this documentary, there was a Converse shoes commercial from 1986 that was featured. It was shot in French Lick, West Baden, at Larry Bird's place. And it featured Magic Johnson arriving in a limo to play Larry Bird one-on-one on his home court. And at that time, the two of them were rivals, and they did not have a speaking relationship. In fact, the Converse shoe company had to convince them to star in this commercial together, and the shoot was kind of awkward, that is, until the first lunch break. Because Magic Johnson was headed off to eat on his own and do his own thing when Larry informed him that his mom had made lunch and had insisted that Magic Johnson join them. And Larry Bird said that meal around his mom's table changed everything. And in the words of Larry Bird, he said, it was at the table that I discovered Irvin Johnson. I never liked Magic, but I liked Irvin a lot. But Irvin didn't come out until I met him at Mom's table. And the two of them have been friends since. In fact, when Magic Johnson was diagnosed with HIV, one of the first calls he made before going public was to Larry Bird. It's amazing what a little Hoosier hospitality at the table can do. And how awesome it is for us here at Mount Gilead to be able to offer a table to our community and to our world where all of us grow and learn and get what we need from Jesus, even in the midst of our different backgrounds and differing gifts and mindsets and needs and approaches and predispositions. Jesus knew exactly what Martha needed, and he also knew where Mary needed to grow, and he knew what was coming in Lazarus' life. So when Martha came in and said, "Lord, don't you even care that my sister's making me do all the work? Tell her to help me." Jesus said in verse 41, "Martha, Martha." Now, when I was a kid, if you said my name twice, it meant I was in trouble. That's not what this is like. This is more like affection. Martha, Martha, you're worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing's necessary. And Mary's chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. She wanted the presence of Jesus, free of distraction. She wanted the word of Jesus, simple necessities, lasting impact that can't be taken away, things that would help them grow as disciples, minus all the clutter and worry and bother. I think one of my favorite preachers in the world to listen to is a man named Mark Scott. He's from Joplin, Missouri. In fact, if you put a gun to my head and made me tell my favorite preacher, I'd probably say Mark Scott. And I heard Mark Scott preach this past week. And he told a story of a missionary who was visiting a part of Africa that he hadn't been to before. And he was out walking one day, and he saw a group of Africans meeting under a tree. And he said he knew exactly what that meant, because whenever he saw a group of Africans meeting under a tree, they were almost always having a worship service. So he went over and he asked this group what they were doing. And they replied, we're worshiping Jesus. And they looked at him and they said, "Do you know Jesus?" And he said, "Yes." And they resumed singing and dancing, and they started saying, "He knows Jesus. He knows Jesus." And they danced around just celebrating the fact that he knows Jesus. And then they stopped and they looked at him again and they said, "We hear there is a book. Is there a book?" And he said, "Yes, there is a book." And they started singing and dancing again. "There is a book. There is a book. There is a book." And then they stopped and they looked at him again and they said, "Do you have the book?" And he said, "I was embarrassed to tell them I have one in every room of the house, all in different kinds of bindings and everything. But I told them, yes, I have the book." And they started singing and dancing again. "He has the book. He has the book. He has the book." And then they stopped again and they said, "But why are you here?" And he reached into his pack and he pulled out some seeds that he had brought. And he said, "There are people far away who care for you, and they want you to have these seeds. You'll be able to plant them. You'll be able to eat the food from the produce that comes. You'll be able to sell some of it and make money. It will be good for your whole village for you to have these seeds. And because we love you, in the name of Jesus, we brought you these seeds." And they said, "Oh, that's nice. Could we have the book first?" That's where Mary's at. She wants to hear the words of Jesus first. She's not worried about what's going on in the kitchen. She's worried about what's coming out of the mouth of Jesus. And yet Jesus knew what Mary needed, what Martha needed, what Lazarus needed, and he met all of them at the table. But then John tells us the second table story. And the second table story happens right between Jesus' temporary hiatus from public life and his very public approach at the triumphal entry. And to set up the verses that we're going to read, Jesus receives word from Mary and Martha that their brother Lazarus is very sick. And when Jesus gets this word, he intentionally delays coming. And so Lazarus dies. In fact, by the time Jesus gets there, Lazarus has been dead 4 days. And after the initial conversation with Mary and Martha, Jesus said, let's go for a walk. Show me the place where he's buried. And so they headed to the graveside. And John 11:38 says, Jesus, again being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. Now it was a cave, and a stone was lying against it, and Jesus said, "Remove the stone." And Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he's been dead 4 days. And Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you will believe, you will see the glory of God? So they removed the stone. And then Jesus raised his eyes and he said, Father, I thank you that you've heard me, and I know that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around it, I said it so that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. And the man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrapping, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, unbind him and let him go. And therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. And you say, well, that's a great story, and I know that story. And yes, there's power in that story, but there's no table in that story. And you said we were going to go to the tables with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. What table? There's no table mentioned here. Are you kidding me? There's no table here? You don't know what I'm talking about? The funeral meal? You know. Fried chicken, potato salad, green beans, rolls and butter. Pretty interesting to read about first century funeral customs. They often buried their dead within a day, if not the same day of death, and they wrapped the body in spices and cloths. And if they had the means, they buried them in rock-hewn family tombs. And the grave sites were sometimes called the houses of silence, or the houses of stones, or even the valley of the dead. And they would start 30 days of mourning. But the first 3 days of those 30 days were the most intense. Funeral talks or orations were given, and the life on earth and the place in heaven of the deceased were spoken of. And lines of well-wishers would console the family, and they would go through the line, not once, but 7 times. You know how hard it is sometimes to come up with something that you want to say to comfort somebody once? Well, they went through the line 7 times. And mourners would visit the grave and wail loudly for days, while others alternated back and forth and stayed with relatives. And there were funeral processions like the one Jesus stopped in a place called Nain when he gave a widow back her son from the dead. And in those funeral processions, the genders were separated, and the mourners and the flutists would wail loudly. And the Jewish Encyclopedia says that the pallbearers were rotated during the procession so that more people could express their closeness and their grief and honor the dead. Probably not a bad idea. Then you don't have to hurt anybody's feelings about who you choose as the pallbearers, right? And yes, according to custom, there was a funeral meal prepared by neighbors, and it was called the meal of consolation: bread, eggs, and lentils. So even in this dark moment for Mary and Martha and Lazarus, there was almost certainly a table. And this is one Mary, Martha, and Lazarus table I wish we had access to, but we don't. I wish the Bible spelled it out for us, would tell us all the details of what happened at this table. Mary and Martha and Lazarus eating what was supposed to be Lazarus' funeral meal, but it had turned into a resurrection dinner party. And by the way, isn't that a great description of what we do around the Lord's table? We commemorate his death, but we also look forward to when he comes because we know he's raised from the dead. Such a sacred table. Can you imagine the conversations that must have took place and the questions they asked Jesus and Lazarus? Why? How? When? Where? I suspect that maybe Lazarus either couldn't remember or couldn't answer some of those questions that had happened during those 4 days, because Scripture says when the Apostle Paul was lifted into the third heaven that he was not able to put into words what he saw, and he said that even if he was able to put it into words, it would not be lawful or allowed for him to utter it. So maybe Lazarus couldn't tell them anything at all about what happened beyond the grave. But can you imagine the joy and the reunion at this funeral meal turned resurrection party? Now, we've often been at tables where there is no happy ending, where tears flow and hearts are broken and life seems unbearable, and yet even then, the shared experience, the mutual encouragement, and the outpourings of love and support nourish us. Jesus and his friends knew that, so we moved to the next table table number 3, John chapter 12, verse 1. Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there. And Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. And Mary then took a pound of a very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples who was intending to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor people?" Now, he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief and he had the money box and he used to pilfer what was put into it. And therefore Jesus said, "Let her alone. Let her alone so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you'll always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." Jesus sees Mary's heart and gift and sacrifice, and he vindicates her. And according to the Gospel of Matthew, he even speaks a prophecy that is being fulfilled in this room today as I speak. Matthew 26, verse 10, Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you bother the woman? She's done a good deed to me. You always have the poor with you. You don't always have me. For when she poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial. And truly, I say to you," here comes the prophecy, "wherever this gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will also be spoken of in memory of her." And here we are, 2,000 years later, speaking of Mary's actions, here at this table where the gospel is preached, just like Jesus said it would be spoken of. Jesus grows us at the table through sacrifice and opposition. And ironically, table number 2 was supposed to be a burial table, a funeral meal, and it became a resurrection table. And table number 3 was supposed to be a party and a celebration, and it became a burial table because she anointed Jesus for burial. And oh, by the way, we also find out here in John 12 that people are watching us at the table. Because John 12, verse 9 says, "The large crowd of the Jews then learned that he was there, and they came, not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus." Jesus grows us at the table and people are watching. And look at the stuff that Jesus uses to grow us at the table. We grow in the way of Jesus. We grow through the words and the worship of Jesus. We grow through the worst with Jesus. We grow with Jesus while we're waiting and walking and weeping and wounded. It's a table where differences are worked out. It's a table where Jesus gives out. It's a table where love is served out. It's a table where grief and pain is loved out. It's a table where sacrifice is poured out. It's a table where wrong is called out. It's a table where the will of God is carried out. And it's a table where we grow and our faith is lived out. And I want with all my heart for Mount Gilead to be a place like that. And in many ways we are, but we can be so much more. And on this Commitment Sunday, this Recommitment Sunday, I'd like to challenge you to be like Mary and to commit to Jesus and his table and his purpose. And really, this sermon only has 2 points today. You can mark it down in the history books. There's just 2 points to this sermon. Now, many times I've preached a sermon with no point. But today, this is just a sermon with 2 points, 2 questions, all right? Question number 1, what are you getting at the table? What are you getting at the table? There are critics and opposition and friends at every table. There are aromas at the table, the smell of food, the smell of life, the smell of perfume, the smell of sacrifice. There's growth at the table. There's pain at the table. There's frustration at the table. And yes, there's sometimes betrayal and false motive and ignorance and evil at the table. But there is Jesus at the table. When you were a toddler, you sat in a high chair at the kids' table and you wanted a place at the adult table with all the big people, right? And then you went to school and you needed to fit in and you wanted to belong, and the school cafeteria made it clear whether you were accepted or not or if you had a place at the table. And then adulthood came, and you worked and contributed and tried to survive and make your opinions known. When it came to how things should be done, you just wanted to be heard and have a place at the table in your life pursuits. And then you got a little older and you started to realize the beauty and the importance of family, and you would give just about anything to have that place at the table with your family as you go through life. And maybe all those words make you sad because somehow, even today, you feel like you have never yet found your place at the table. But along comes Jesus, who says, I don't care where you've been or what you've done or how you've failed or how you've been accepted or not. My sacrifice is for you, and the ground is level here, and you have a place at the table. And he breaks down the barriers and the caste systems and the pretense and the self-importance. And he forgives, and he gives you a place at the table. This is a communal thing. And the question is, how are you seizing those opportunities? We're getting ready to offer some things like MG University, for instance, but we can't make people seize those opportunities. What are you getting at the table? And the second question is this: what are you bringing to the table? Martha brought her service of love and her distractions. Mary brought her devotion and most prized possession, her perfume. Lazarus brought his gratitude and joy. Judas brought his selfishness and ulterior motive and betrayal. The disciples brought their willingness. People brought their curiosity. Everybody brought their baggage and their perspectives and their preconceived notions. But Jesus brought truth and love and clarity and life. One evening last week, I was in a restaurant in Canada with some folks there. And one of them in our conversation mentioned the Halifax explosion. If I talk about the Halifax explosion, how many of you know what the Halifax explosion is? Well, neither did I, and so I cautiously showed my ignorance and I said, what do you mean, the Halifax explosion? And the story that I heard was so interesting that when I got home, I went and ordered this new book called The Great Halifax Explosion. 100 years ago, December 1917, there was a French ship that was carrying munitions for World War I, and it made its way into Halifax Harbor in Nova Scotia, and it was loaded with 6 million pounds of high explosives, including 3 kilotons of TNT. At 8:46 a.m., that freighter, which was named the Mont Blanc, collided in the harbor with a Norwegian relief ship, and that ignited some of the barrels of airplane fuel that were on board, and so the crew of the Mont Blanc began to escape in their lifeboats. Of course, that created some excitement in the harbor, and so the people of Halifax, including workers and school children, stood on the shore watching the scene, not knowing what else was on the ship. And 18 minutes later, that ship exploded like a bomb, later determined to be the power, 1/5 the power of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. It caused a tsunami that was about 37 feet high. It was an explosion like one that had never been seen before, and it leveled half of Halifax, and it killed 2,000 people. It injured 9,000 people, and it left another 25,000 people homeless. And at that time, there was great animosity between Canada and Massachusetts across the Bay of Fundy. But hours after hearing of the disaster, without being asked, the governor of Massachusetts sent massive loads of relief, about $1 million worth, along with 400 medical workers to Halifax. And they had to make their way through one of the biggest blizzards in the past decade in the Maritimes at that time. And they arrived from Boston even before help from Toronto and Montreal got there. And they continued to render aid and send even more aid long after the initial tragedy. And the two enemies, Boston and Canada, became friends that day. And to this day, every year, Halifax, Nova Scotia sends its biggest and best Nova Scotia Christmas tree to Boston, and it's lit and placed in the Boston Commons. This year, it cost $180,000 to do that. The Christmas tree extension specialist, whose responsibility is to select that tree every year, is always looking for trees, and it keeps a list of trees every year. And the scouting for the current year's tree begins in June or July. And those trees aren't grown on tree farms like you might expect, but in multiple places, and people actually vie for the honor of donating the tree. And most donors are honored to give up their tree, and most will gladly watch their towering 40 or 50 foot perfect tree fall, knowing the reason it's being sent to Boston. And owners who would not normally have dreamed of cutting down the spruce that Grandpa planted will gladly part with it when told it's going to Boston. And they consider it a great honor, and they say, oh my, how could I refuse? As one native of Nova Scotia put it, it's never time to stop saying thank you. May I ask, how can we refuse to move and give and grow sacrificially to make a place at Christ's table? Now is not the time to stop saying thank you. And that's why I want to invite you today to participate in a renewal of our commitment to a place at the table. But even before that, a commitment to Christ. And if you have a decision to make for Christ today, I want to remind you, as we do every week, that just outside those doors and on the left, there is a prayer room. Second door on the left, there's somebody waiting there to talk with you. And if you want to recommit your life to Christ or even commit to Jesus for the first time, today is the day to do that. There will be somebody there to help you and instruct you and pray with you and lead you in that. But today on this Recommitment Sunday is also an opportunity to recommit to a place at the table initiative. Maybe you filled out one of those commitment cards like the one that is on your chair a year ago when we started this, or maybe you weren't even here yet when we started this, and this is an opportunity for you to get on board, or it's an opportunity for you to renew your commitment, or perhaps you satisfied it and you want to make a new commitment. Today is the day to do that. So if you haven't filled that out yet, would you fill it out? And here's what we're going to do. I don't want to put any pressure on anybody or make anyone uncomfortable, but in a moment, we're going to play a song that's become very familiar to us since we started this whole Place at the Table initiatives. And as that song is played, I'm going to give you an opportunity. There are a couple of boxes here, and you can come up during that song and drop your renewal commitment card in the box as we sing. And if you don't wish to do that, there's another one that's placed out in the lobby that you can catch on your way out at the Place at the Table display. And we want to invite you to renew your commitment to this or invite you to become a part of it for the first time. So we're going to listen to those words that have become so familiar to us and give you the opportunity. And when that song is finished and we've had that opportunity, then I'll come up and close with prayer. So now's the time for us to make those commitments.